Welcome, everyone. For those of you who were able to join us for our previous session, thank you and welcome back. Today is our second session of our three-part masterclass. In today's session, we'll be taking a deep dive into trends and best practices in goal setting and feedback. We'll be walking through some best practices to help you successfully apply goal setting and drive feedback within your organizations. My name is Aaron Adams. I'm the VP of Professional Services at Engagedly and a lifelong student of the employee experience. With me, again, is the talented Dr. Edie Goldberg. For those of you who don't know Edie, she is a leading industry expert in the field of performance enablement with over 25 years of specialized experience in human capital management and organizational development. She's a keynote speaker, author of The Inside Gig, and more. And for those of you who don't know Edie, that's a very abbreviated version of some of her accolades. Edie, welcome.
Thanks so much, Aaron. That's a nice introduction. And welcome, everyone. I'm excited to get into our session with you. So welcome to Module 2, Trends and Best Practices in both Goal Setting and Feedback. Is what we're going to cover today. Would you be surprised to learn that only 23% of employees strongly agree that their managers provide meaningful feedback to them? You guys, that's less than 25%. That's less than a quarter of your employees. That's simply sad. But for those employees that do feel like their manager provides meaningful feedback to them, they are 3.5 times more likely to be engaged at work. And this is really important because we know that engaged employees are more productive. So this is a very, very important statistic to pay attention to. So the path to greater organizational productivity and performance may very well be through ensuring that employees are getting meaningful feedback and coaching. So I want to kind of use this statistic to kind of set the stage for why we need to change some of our practices and what's going on today. So here's a brief agenda about what we're going to be covering in today's module. We're going to talk about a little bit of goal setting theory, but mostly practice. And we're going to also talk about what are some of the more evolving practices happening in goal setting. We're going to spend a great deal of time talking about feedback and a little bit of time at the end talking about development, which always seems to get a short shrift here. For those of you who were with us in Module 1, you'll recall that I'm going to be sharing some research that I did in 2020 with about 130 really well-recognized organizations and how they execute on their performance management process. And we really, really looked at what were the practices that helped companies to achieve their intended goals with performance management. So I'm going to share that research, but I'm also going to share research from other people like Gallup that I just shared to help kind of help you understand what's going on today and some of the challenges that we have and some of the opportunities that we have to improve our performance management practices. Now, in our study, we found that most employers were pretty happy with their goal setting process. In fact, 93% of my study participants said that they were happiest with this element of their process, which kind of surprised me because every time I consult with an organization, they always tell me how they struggle with goal setting. But people said they were happiest with this element of the process. So here's the science part of our webinar. Goal motivation theory is one of those things that as an industrial organizational psychologist, I love to talk about because it's one of the most proven theories of motivation that we have in psychological science. Okay, so here's what goal motivation theory tells us. If you set specific, clear goals, that's clarity, that are challenging at the right level of complexity, so people have control over the outcomes, where individuals personally commit to achieving those goals. So you can't just give people goals, they have to buy in and commit to it. And you give them regular feedback on progress towards those goals. You set up the condition for motivation. and employees will outperform under this condition individuals that are told to just kind of do your best, or if you don't say anything about kind of what type of goals they're trying to achieve. Over half of the companies in my study said that they do indeed set challenging or difficult goals as part of their process. Stretch goals, you might think of them as. And those companies that did set these challenging goals were more likely than other companies to say that they achieve their intended goals with the process. So here we see more evidence for this element of the theory that setting challenging goals really does improve performance. But having goals alone will not create performance or motivate performance. Employees need ongoing feedback on progress towards their goals for goals to be motivating. You can't just set goals and then discuss them again at the end of the year. And this is, I think, where most of our kind of goal setting processes really fall down, because we don't spend enough time giving people on feedback on progress towards their goals. Now, for most of you, you're probably familiar with SMART goals, right? This is kind of the dominant framework that we see in goal setting. In fact, in our study, 57% of the companies said that they use either the SMART goal methodology or a very similar one called simple goals. And the way in which simple goals differs is, so simple stands for specific, important, and measurable. So specific, very similar here. Measurable, you see that on here too. The important piece is what is kind of different and simple, where they are just trying to focus on a few really, really important goals. So one of the issues that we find in goal setting is that a lot of employees don't kind of see how their own individual goals align with what the company is trying to achieve. So this research from Gallup said that only 35% of employees feel that their goals are aligned with company goals. And 2/3 of the participants of their study said that, you know, our shifting priorities make it really difficult to set annual goals. And as we discussed last week, the future of goal setting really lies in the need for companies to be more flexible and more responsive to changes in their goal setting process. So what I want to do now is talk about some of the more evolving practices in goal setting. We're going to talk about 4 different things. First, we're going to talk about making goals flexible and providing kind of more direction on goals as opposed to being so specific about the tasks that need to get done. We're going to talk about the importance of frequent discussions. We're going to talk about leveraging the power of purpose and meaning, and a shift from individual to team-based goals. So we'll go through each one of these. The first is flexible and directional goals. What you see here on this graphic on the bottom of this screen really talks about the difference between what is cascading goals and what is alignment of goals. Very traditionally, organizations have cascaded their goals. So we start with the corporate goal setting, and then once that's done, we then set our department goals, and then we set our team goals. And once the team goals are set, then we set individual goals. And the problem with this process is by the time we're like down to individual setting goals, 3 months have gone by, like a quarter of the entire year. The concept around alignment makes it a little bit more flexible and certainly faster. So here, corporate goals and department goals are generally kind of set together. Think of those corporate goals as your true north, what the company's really trying to achieve, and the department goals kind of play into that. So those are often set together. And then individuals set their goals so that they align to either the corporate goal or the individual goal. And we're going to talk a little bit in a moment about some of these more flexible, more agile goal setting methodologies like OKR and FAST. I am going to talk about that in a minute. But Aaron, I want to bring you on screen here for a second. I'd love to know how Engagedly's technology really supports the concept of flexible and directional goals.
Yeah, one of the things you said, flexibility, right? The flexibility is very important, probably one of the most important things for us to account for. So rather than prescribing an approach to our clients, we provide them with the capability to, as you mentioned, cascade or align their goals based on what works best for them. We recognize that in some roles, departments, or even the approaches that you'd reference, there's kind of a mix, right? Top down, bottom up, or sometimes even cross-functional. Since goals encompass most of what we're trying to achieve in the organization, we understand that how we do it in the system needs to be really flexible and accommodating. Additionally, as you mentioned, priorities change. So probably one of the most important functionalities as it relates to goal setting is your ability to easily edit them and make changes in real time and record those changes. It's important that we provide our clients with an open system. It's not locked and fixed. It's more agile, and it can accommodate those ongoing changes in the business.
I love that because, the goals that we set at the beginning of the year often aren't the goals that we need when it comes to the end of the year. So being able to change those goals so that people are kind of focused on the most important things for the company, I think that's really great functionality. So let me talk a little bit about OKRs and the FAST goal setting methodology. Although I said that the SMART methodology is kind of the dominant framework that's happening today, in my study, 25% of the participants have shifted to the OKR methodology, which I think is really kind of growing in popularity because of its simplicity and its specificity. OKRs are simply a goal setting method that is really designed to help people try and achieve their most ambitious goals with really measurable results. So it moves people really away from a task focus to a greater focus on outcomes, what the objectives that you're really trying to achieve and the outcomes that you're getting. So some people think OKRs is a new goal setting methodology. It's not. It's actually been around since the 1990s, and it was first developed by Intel, although really popularized by Google, who started using it when they formed in 1999. And it really supported their growth from 40 employees in 1999 to 140,000 employees today. But OKRs aren't just a goal-setting methodology for technology companies. Companies in every industry have moved to this approach because it's kind of more simple and more impactful than setting a SMART goal, which can kind of miss the mark in its either specificity in terms of its task focus or kind of not driving to what is the most important issue that you're focused on. So there are two parts to an OKR, right? The first is the objective or the overall outcome that you're trying to achieve. And this is really generally stated in terms of a lofty, inspirational outcome that you're trying to achieve, like delight customers, not just, please our customers, not just execute against customer expectations, but actually delight our customers. It's meant to be aspirational. So while the tasks that you engage in to achieve this objective might change over time, that broad objective isn't going to change. And that's one of the things that differs, in SMART goals, we tend to focus a bit more on tasks, whereas OKRs are focused on that larger aspirational objective. The second part of OKR or the KR are your key results, right? So how will you measure your success in achieving your objective? It answers the question, how will I know that I have achieved what I set out to do? Aaron, You talk to a lot of companies about implementing performance management systems. Are you seeing a lot of interest in the OKR methodology?
Absolutely. The more agile goal setting methodologies are extremely popular. Additionally, that discipline that comes from the OKR methodology is attractive as well. So focus on what matters. You hear people say often, and that, like you said, simple, more focused, more specific. The transparency, alignment, focused discussions, and execution of the overall strategy are the things that we'd like any ideal goal setting system and approach to solve for. So as people are using this more agile approach, our professional services team over the last few years has been deepening our expertise about the OKR methodology. And now we even work with clients to train and coach them how to use a tool to drive that approach as well.
Yeah. So, it's new, so everybody needs to kind of understand. So thanks for sharing that. So what is the FAST goal setting methodology? It really is a methodology that reflects the dynamic nature of work. So kind of breaking this down, the F stands for frequent discussions, which is really about embedding performance conversations in your weekly or monthly one-on-ones so that you can review progress towards goals. I talked about that earlier. You can check on priorities. Is this the most important thing for you to be focused on right now? Determine what kind of resources do you need to achieve your objectives, and also, providing people with the feedback and the coaching that they need to be successful. A stands for ambitious, just like in the SMART goal setting methodology. It has to be challenging, but achievable. Specific, same as kind of a traditional goal setting, very similar to SMART goals. It's about what you're trying to achieve and how you're going to measure the success of that goal. But transparent, the T, that's something new here. And this actually excites me because I think this is really important. It's about making goals public for other people to see. Teams that are kind of tight and really in sync with each other are more productive than teams that really aren't aware of what others on the team are working on. So this idea of making goals more transparent is really important. And while both FAST and OKRs are oriented towards having more frequent conversations, regardless of what goal setting methodology you use, more frequent conversations around goals and around feedback are really becoming the standard practice. I'm sure you guys have all heard about Adobe's check-in process. It's really about having these more frequent check-ins, more frequent conversations around performance. So this is a simple model of continuous performance management. So rather than setting goals at the beginning of the year, maybe having a mid-year conversation and then evaluating at the end of the year, it's a more continuous process where we plan and align at the beginning of the year. But now we're getting feedback, we're coaching, we're tracking progress, we're adjusting our goals all throughout the year. And in my study, those companies that had a continuous performance management process were significantly more likely to achieve their desired outcomes than companies that had an annual, semi-annual, or more of an event-driven process. So frequent discussions is really, really important. The third evolving practice in performance management is leveraging the power of purpose and meaning. Helping employees to kind of connect to the work that they do to the greater good that the company is trying to serve helps to drive performance and increase employee engagement. So when setting and aligning goals, making connections to how an individual is facilitating the purpose of the company's mission is something that can be very, very motivating for employees. So to give you some examples from some of my client organizations, in construction and in affordable housing, building homes to improve the lives of others, like everyone can connect their goals to something like that. Or in banking, it's about creating solutions for stronger communities. And one of my favorites comes from the Sherm Foundation, and I'm on the board of the Sherm Foundation. And their mission is to elevate and empower HR as a force for positive social change. So when you connect the work that you're doing to that mission, it is very motivating for individuals. There's a famous story of somebody who was doing a job analysis on a janitor in NASA. And the person said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm helping put a man on the moon." And the job analyst is like scratching their head like, "You're a janitor, dude." But he knew that by creating a clean and safe environment for everybody else in the building, that he was contributing to the mission of putting a man on the moon. And that is really motivating for people. Here you see a quote from some research from Sean Anker and team. 9 out of 10 people would be willing to earn less money to do more meaningful work. And boy, that is more true today than it has been in the past. We spend a lot of time tying goals to financial rewards. But today's research indicates that finding purpose and meaning in your work drives performance more than an increase in merit or your bonus pay. My fourth topic here is moving from individual to team-based goals. Well, in North America, where I live, and in most European countries, we have very individualistic cultures. So most of our performance management processes have always been focused on setting individual goals and rewarding individual performance. But research tells us that when a group has something that they're working on together, they're more enthusiastic about their work, they communicate with each other much better, they cooperate more, they work harder, and they accomplish more. No one wants to let the team down, right? Yeah, sure, there are going to be some slackers sometimes, but we all know about peer pressure, and we all know that peer pressure works. You certainly see that with your kids, or you experienced it when you were a kid. So there is something to be said about kind of the pressure that your peers will be putting on you. And as we discussed in Module 1, our work is growing in complexity, and 85% of our time at work is now spent in collaborative work activities. So since more and more of our work is being done in teams, wouldn't it make sense to move more towards setting team-based goals and rewarding people based on the collective performance of the team, rather than strictly focusing on what an individual is doing? I think our work is so complex today that often our outcomes are not the result of our own individual performance. It's about the collective performance of what everybody's doing to make that outcome happen. So I really encourage you to think in your organization, would it behoove you to set more team-based goals and to reward people for team-based performance rather than individual performance? So that kind of wraps up our section on goal setting. And we're now going to kind of pivot and move towards feedback. And as I said when I introduced goal setting theory, feedback on progress is a critical element of the motivating power of goals. But most companies kind of fail at that, right? We don't consistently provide that feedback on progress. So let's look at some of what the research tells us about feedback and how we can leverage that information to help us to improve our performance management processes. So in my study, we asked participants, which element of your process is most important to driving motivation and performance? And because of my love of goal setting theory, I thought it was going to be goal setting. But no, you see here, 50% of the participants said it's actually the feedback and coaching elements of the performance management process that really drive motivation and performance. And at first I was a little confused about this. And then I realized that that setting goals is kind of, that getting feedback and coaching is really in service of the goals that are set. So this does make sense to me after all, but I was initially kind of surprised by that result. Zenger and Folkman did some research that is very, very well known. This is a study of over 22,000 leaders across a wide variety of industries in different countries. And they looked at employees' intention to leave. So you see on the horizontal axis, on the vertical axis, sorry, the intent to turn over, relative to how people rated their managers' ability to provide frequent, honest, and effective feedback. And that assessment was done through the gathering of 360 feedback on those leaders. And what they found is that employee retention is significantly higher when managers provide frequent and effective feedback. Or what you see here is that the intent to turn over is lower when managers are better at providing effective feedback. It's important. But what we found in our study was that managers have largely gotten the message about feedback. They just aren't really good at it, right? So most of the organizations in our study said that they are communicating regularly about the importance of providing feedback to individual employees. And in our study, at least 50% of the companies said that they are providing feedback at least quarterly. So that's much more frequent than we have in the past. But managers just aren't good at it. So look at this rating here. 58% of companies rate their managers as only fair in this skill. And almost 15% evaluate them as flat out poor at being effective at providing feedback and coaching. But companies that rate their managers as being more skilled in feedback were significantly more likely to achieve their desired outcomes in our study. So as you think about designing your program, don't forget the part about implementation, right? Designing your process isn't where it's all at. In your implementation effort, you need to train your managers about how to effectively have those meaningful feedback conversations with their employees, feedback and coaching, I would argue, because that is really what is going to make the difference in whether or not you're successful with your process. In our study, we found that companies that gave feedback more often were significantly more likely to report that they had indeed achieved their intended outcomes. And that supports this previous research from the Center for Effective Organizations at USC, where they found that those companies that had a performance feedback culture achieved better business results. So you are, I'm sure, are asking, what in the world is a performance feedback culture? It's an environment where managers feel compelled to provide ongoing helpful feedback to their employees because senior level managers talk about the importance of it. They role model providing feedback. They provide training on how to do it well. And they are recognized and rewarded for engaging in that behavior, providing feedback to their employees. They also encourage their employees to ask for feedback. But what's really important here is you're trying to sell the idea internally. I want to share these research results with you because this is a great way to convince your leadership that you need to invest more money in becoming a performance feedback culture. Here you see that regardless of how we measure company performance, those companies that excel in a performance feedback culture, that is the top third of companies that kind of engaged in more practices that supported a performance feedback culture, significantly outperformed those companies who were at the bottom third. In fact, we see a direct linear relationship of those companies' performance feedback culture practices and their organizational performance, regardless of if it's net profit margin, or return on investment. ROA is a measure of how profitable a company is relative to its total assets. And ROE is a measure of profitability relative to shareholder equity. So regardless of how you look at it, becoming a performance feedback culture is going to pay out dividends to your organization. So I want to share some more contemporary research that's really impacting how companies are approaching the design of their performance management processes. Some of you may have heard of research from Carol Dweck on growth mindsets. Her research talks about how our mindset impacts kind of our lives and how we work. And she says we have two different mindsets. One is a fixed mindset and one is a growth mindset. And her work argues that many managers and companies operate really with a fixed mindset perspective, right? So their employees are selected for their inherent brilliance or talents that they have. So they see those people as pretty static and not changing at all. And employees with this fixed mindset, they avoid challenges because if they don't perform in an outstanding and stellar way, other people might question their view of them as being extremely talented. So they avoid those challenges. And they exert minimal effort because they think things should come easy to them, right? And exerting more effort won't actually change the outcome. You either got it or you don't got it. And that's the perspective of people with a fixed mindset. They ignore negative feedback because it threatens their kind of perceived success. But in contrast, those people who have a growth mindset, they embrace challenges and they work hard when they're faced with obstacles because they see that as a path to personal growth. And growth mindset individuals, they embrace all kinds of feedback as a point of learning, and they love to learn from other people's success, and they're inspired by the success of other people. Very different approaches at work. This research has huge implications for how we approach performance management and simply the words that we use with our employees so that they develop a growth mindset. So when you're having an evaluation kind of conversation, it has to be based on the assumption that with the right context and the right kind of support, anyone's performance can be improved. You're not a fixed entity. Several well-known companies like Gap Inc. and Microsoft have made growth mindset a real core part of their process, and they focus very much on development and helping people to continuously grow and improve. Neuro leadership is another area that has really taken had a big impact in the practice of performance management. So the field of neuroscience and neuro leadership has been contributing to our understanding about how to successfully lead and managing people for probably about a decade now. What this says is every 5 seconds, our brain is automatically searching for a threat or reward state. And unfortunately, there are a lot of elements in the performance review process that creates a threat response in our brain. The impact of that threat response is that our brain literally shuts down and turns off to any new information in a deeply protective state. So I'm kind of going into my performance review conversation and I stop listening to everything because all the lights and sirens are going off because I feel threatened by that conversation. David Rock has put forth a model, the SCARF model, to explain an individual's response to the performance review conversation. So let me quickly review the elements of this in case you're unfamiliar with it. The first is status. So during a performance review conversation, our status might be threatened by the rating that we receive and how it compares to perhaps the rating of other people. A majority of people believe that they're above average, right? That's a statistical impossibility, but most people believe that they're above average. So if they get any rating that is below that, then they will be deeply threatened by that particular rating. Bottling up feedback for the end of the year conversation creates a huge amount of uncertainty. And that is what sends those lights and sirens off in our brain. Change also creates uncertainty. So if we have a change in our rating from how we've been rated in the past, that can be perceived as a threat as well. Our brain likes control and stability, and it likes to be in the driver's seat. And in the performance review conversation, generally it's the manager that is in the driver's seat, and that decreases an employee's level of autonomy and perceive the entire situation as a threat. Our brains really pretty quickly compute how much alike we are to those people who are around us. If we dislike our manager, we'd probably pretty much automatically dismiss any kind of negative feedback that we got from him or her. But if our rating is less than stellar, it might be a threat to our perceived relationship that we have with our manager. And finally, if we perceive bias or favoritism in a rating, or if we don't feel that our rewards are appropriate for the effort that we gave or relative to our peers, then we'll see this conversation about pay and performance as a threat to ourselves. Many organizations have used the findings from this research to redesign their performance management processes to, one, eliminate the focus on a rating, to put the employee in control of the conversation so that it creates a less threatening environment, by making performance management more continuous so we don't have that uncertainty because we're getting feedback all year long. And so those are some of the ways in which companies have used this research to change their performance management approach. And while the research that I've shared thus far clearly shows that feedback is important, I'm going to argue that the nature of that feedback is really important as well. In our study, as well as the original research that we found from Marshall Goldsmith, using feedback, we found that using feedback to enable performance improvement was significantly related to achieving your intended outcomes with your performance management process. So coaching for future performance leads to better outcomes than simply providing feedback on kind of past performance, kind of looking in the rearview mirror, which tends to be more critical. So I'm going to argue that you should, rather than feedback, feed forward to people and help them to use the insight of what has happened in the past to improve their performance going forward. 360 feedback is another type of feedback. And so the question might be, what is it? So as this picture kind of demonstrates, it's feedback from all the different perspectives that you might get 360, right? From yourself, your manager, your peers, your direct reports, and even potentially from your customers. But what's important to understand with 360 feedback is all those different perspectives might be different and true. How I show up with my peers might be very different than how I behave in front of my manager. So getting 360 feedback, you shouldn't just simply combine all those ratings saying we'll have a truer rating if we average across all those people, because the experience that those different groups have with your performance or with an employee's performance may be very different. So those different perspectives are real and important and should be looked at, not just overall collapsing over everyone, but looking at those individual perspectives. So there are a lot of things to consider when using 360 feedback for whatever purposes. So 360 feedback was originally created really to be used more in leadership development. So it tends to be based on leadership behaviors or competencies that are important for the organization. And research has really found that when you're asking people for feedback to somebody just to help them to improve their performance, not to rate them on anything that would have implications around their pay, that people are much more honest, right? They give honest assessments. And I've actually found this in my own work in having focus groups with employees. When they were providing 360 feedback on their peers, they would say, well, I maybe wasn't as honest as I could have been because I didn't want to impact their ability to get their full bonus or their ability to, get an annual increase or the next promotion. So using it for development, we tend to find that the ratings people give are a little bit more honest, perhaps blunt, because it's really designed to help the individual. When we pivot and we start to use 360 for evaluation purposes, and those evaluations are going to be used to define somebody's compensation or impact their ability to get a promotion, now what we see is some inflation in the ratings, right? Because we're a little bit more generous than we would be when it's used for decision making. But a really important thing to think about when using 360 feedback for decision-making purposes is you can't use the same 360 instrument that you use for development that you're using for decision-making. Because when we're talking about leadership development, maybe all those elements about leadership aren't an important part of our job, but we're helping somebody to learn and grow to become a leader. When you use 360 for decision-making purposes, the behaviors that you're evaluating somebody on have to be either directly linked to their success in their role or success in the company achieving their business strategy. So what you rate on might be different. Crowdsourced feedback is another kind of 360 feedback, but a little bit different. In 360 feedback, we tend to rate people on specific behaviors. Crowdsourced feedback tends to be much more behavioral in nature and doesn't require a rating. So often crowdsourced feedback, employees get evaluated by their peers, maybe at the end of a project, or after I gave a presentation, I might solicit feedback from others about how I did or what I could improve. Sometimes companies that have a crowdsourced element to their performance management process might ask something like, what should this employee start doing more of to be more successful? What should they stop doing? What should they continue doing? Or what behaviors have helped lead this person to achieve their goals, and what behaviors got in the way of team performance? So they tend to elicit more verbal descriptions of behavior so that a manager has more insight into how the individual is performing rather than getting a rating. Aaron, this is one of those areas where I think today's technology really helps us shine and do things that we were never able to do before. So it helps companies to gather 360 feedback or to facilitate crowdsourced feedback. What advice do you give to your customers on using 360 feedback for performance management?
Yeah, well, one of the things you said was technology can make your 360 process more inclusive, right? While providing you the flexibility also to kind of tailor the approach directly to that purpose or the strategy, whether that be development or even, like you said, at times now performance. So when we talk with our clients, the system really has the capability to configure the process to what best suits their approach. And then ultimately, we have partnered with our clients to guide them through the process and to think through it, right? What's the design of the survey and the questionnaire around your purpose? What's the nomination process? The preferences for sharing and collecting the feedback. So around anonymity, depending on the purpose, what's that level of anonymity, the number of reviewers they may want to have, relationships to reviewees. So for different purposes, again, you may be looking at different types of working relationships, using the appropriate rating scales, and then even the debriefing methods. So technology's really advanced and kind of helped us to guide those discussions, make it really easy to facilitate. And then when you talked about when it comes to performance, we just remind them it's important that the information you're gathering is connected to the strategy and that the intended purpose of that 360 is really shared with those employees. It can be a great tool really from aligning the expectations, focusing the development conversations, and ultimately making some of the talent decisions too as well. So outside of those, the last thing we really tell them to think about or just help them envision is 360s really need to be kind of integrated into the key HR systems and processes. So those are just some of the things we talk through them with, and we provide them the capability to do as well.
Great points. Great point. So, 360 feedback has been kind of rising in the use within the performance management context, but there are definitely some things to be cautious about. Recognition is, I think, a special form of feedback, right? It's just a positive form of feedback. So when I think about recognition, I really kind of define it as the acknowledgement or appreciation for a behavior or an outcome that somebody has achieved. And recognition can be formal, right? You can have a formal feedback process where you nominate the employee of the month, or it can be informal, right? Your manager can stop you in the hallway and say, hey, that presentation went really well. You had a really great impact. That is recognition as well. Often recognition isn't part of the performance management process, or it's not perceived to be part of the performance management process, but I think it's a really, really critical element to driving engagement and performance. So I do see it as an important part of performance management, which is why I'm mentioning it here. I love this quote from Gallup because I think it really demonstrates the importance of recognition within your company. Recognition from one's managers, peers, or customers is much more memorable than any kind of financial reward that you can give to your employee. And I think that just speaks volumes. So some people have asked, now that we've moved into a hybrid and remote environment, what's different about feedback in this context than in our old ways of working? One, I would say that we need to be more intentional about checking in with our employees, providing feedback, and coaching for success. So you're not just going to see people in the workplace. You have to kind of reach out and set up those sessions and intentionally have conversations so that you know what people are working on. But important is consistency. Whether you're in the office or out of the office, we need to have the same rhythm and pace of those feedback and touch-based conversations so that we don't inadvertently develop some proximity bias. That is, those people who are in the office get more feedback, more coaching, more access to development opportunities than those people who are out of the office. So being consistent with all of your employees is really important. The other thing I say is, ask for feedback from your coworkers, because a lot of times you're going to be in team-based meetings with your coworkers and not with your manager. So they may be seeing the results of your performance or how you engage with others more than your manager would. And related to that, give feedback to other people. If things aren't going well on a team, if somebody's not communicating well, if somebody's not kind of perceived to be pulling their weight, have those conversations, supportive conversations with each other, and give that feedback to each other. Aaron, what are you seeing from your clients kind of related to feedback in a remote environment?
Mhm. Yeah, first, feedback is definitely a responsibility. As we always talk about, the frequency of feedback behavior has increased significantly. What initially was like kind of assumed as a nice to have in these feedback loops and these channels through digital turned quickly into a need to have. Right at the onset of the pandemic, what we had seen was a significant jump in surveys. So surveys being consistently done on those weekly basis, right? Wellness surveys, kind of checking in with their employees. That was something we saw jump pretty quickly. Then in talking to our clients, what we saw a lot of times too were a lot of task feedback being done in things like Slack and Teams. But most of the goal and behavioral feedback being captured that we saw was in our system. And those were more frequent. Some of those loops kind of tying that goal conversation, those frequent conversations and feedback loops together. People were using those more often because the system essentially gave us the ability to give us not only real-time feedback to goals, but to each other. And then really doing that from people at any time. One of the interesting stats here that I pulled for our discussion was around check-ins. Check-ins were a nice way for us to kind of do this on a recurring basis. We saw them back in 2019, there was about 1,500 check-ins done in our system. That jumped to 2,600 in 2020. And then just as where we're at today, this year in 2021, we're at about 3,600. So from 2019 to now, we're seeing about a 234% increase in the number of check-ins. So we're starting to see these more frequent discussions, more frequent conversations, whether that be surveys, goal discussions, 360s, or just general real-time feedback. They're definitely increasing the frequency.
That's fantastic. I think that's great news overall for performance management in general. So thanks for sharing that. So as I said, we're going to wrap things up with development planning. And in module 1, I talked about how little attention development planning gets in most performance management processes. But recent research has really demonstrated that employees are more satisfied with their performance management process if it is more development focused than focused on evaluation. And this is the reason that we have seen some companies really focus on that growth mindset and a move to more of a focus on development than evaluation. Some tactics companies have used to, I asked the question here, how will you make development more of a focus for your own performance management process? I really want you all to kind of think about that question, but to share some examples of from some of my clients. 3 things that I see frequently are moving development planning to the mid-year part of the cycle so it doesn't get lost in the performance business goal setting. That is, you spend so much time setting business goals that we don't allocate any time to development planning. So instead, move it to a time where the only focus is on development planning. Another is to explicitly tie the development planning to goal achievement. So when you're setting your goals, then the question becomes, what kind of development do you need to achieve these goals? So they become more tied together. And the third is, this is kind of, I think, why we've seen some companies eliminating ratings. That is, they make the entire process focused on feedback, coaching, and development, and not on evaluation. And that's another way to focus more on development planning. So employee satisfaction isn't really the only reason to focus more on development, not by a long shot. This research from I4CP shows us that managers in high-performing companies were twice as likely to create development plans for their employees. I would say develop and execute on those development plans. And consistent with this research, in my study, we found that companies that viewed development goals as very important or an important part of their process were significantly more likely to achieve their intended outcomes with the process. But unfortunately, development planning, it's often a second thought. It rarely gets the attention that it deserves, but it is critical for improving performance. And development, it might be based on the skills I need to achieve a goal. It might be, we've done an assessment of your competencies and we're going to focus on those areas that have the greatest opportunity for development. Traditionally, companies have really focused development planning on shoring up those opportunity areas. But recently, researchers have argued that it's actually more productive to focus employees on developing their strengths rather than trying to shore up weaknesses. And that has given rise to this whole new strengths-based movement. So you'll see many companies that development planning is strictly focused on leveraging your strengths rather than fixing development opportunities. Huge debate about what's the right thing. I like to balance them both. So you have some things that are focused on real areas that need to be improved because skills aren't where they need to be, and also focusing on how do we leverage our strengths. Effective development can take a whole lot of forms, and it's really a multifaceted activity. But when considering development planning and kind of the activities, you got to remember the 70-20-10 rule. Adult learners achieve their most effective development through practical experience, learning while doing. So planned and intentional learning through on-the-job opportunities and activities is the biggest opportunity for development within your company. Another 20% of effective development happens when we learn from other people, right? So that includes ongoing feedback and coaching and mentoring, all kinds of working with other role models, shadowing other people, etc. And formal classes and training and workshops should really only account for like 10% of an employee's development. But formal learning has to be practiced and reinforced. It's really important that you support your employees when they're going through that formal kinds of training. So before an employee goes into a training activity or training course, you have to discuss what they're intending to learn so that they're kind of attuned and turned into what they should learn. So it doesn't just kind of go over their head. And then when they come out of that training, having a very active conversation about what was learned and how are you going to apply that back on the job is really, really important. So I want to thank you for your time today, give you a quick summary about what we've talked about. Goal setting is really critical for motivation and alignment within your organization, but you don't have to cascade goals. You can simply align. So your goals need to be agile, particularly today when our businesses are constantly shifting. So having practices that allow you to update and change goals is really important. Remember to move from feedback to feed forward. That is, coach your employees for performance. And you have to, in your implementation efforts, focus on training your managers, building those skills within your managers, because that is kind of one of the biggest factors that drives success in performance management. And remember that managers today shouldn't be the only source of feedback. We work more and more with our peers, and they're great sources of feedback. So let's bring them into that process through some kind of 360 or crowdsourced feedback, recognition program, etc. Other people have a lot of insight into our performance. And with development, I'm going to go with Nike here and say, just do it. Focus on development. It's such an important part of your process. Aaron, thank you for having me here today.
Yeah, Edie, thank you so much for bringing your insight and your expertise into the conversation today. Thank you to our audience for your time and willingness to learn with us and problem solve. As a reminder, today is session 2 of 3. Next session, we will be discussing the science of performance ratings and an introduction to the new model for performance enablement. If you found today's session helpful, please tell your friends and colleagues. We're excited to learn together. Thank you again for joining, and keep creating engaging experiences.